The long gravel
Kingsley was a gift
drive
from
was
Lady
filled
Eleanor.
with the
We have the
regular
letter.
clip-clop of
Confusion.
hoofs and
This
the
animal
groan
has a
of aged
microchip
leather.
attached to it. Should we let the
Tall but a
scanner make
little
the decision?
stooped with age, Arthur Penrose patted
No.
Kingsley's broad
Kingsley
neck
was a
and
gift from
adjusted
Lady
the
Eleanor.
last strap on the leash.
We have
With
the
a low
letter.
grunt, the ancient Shire horse replied, shifting his enormous weight in the polished black gig's shafts. It was an antique carriage that Arthur had refurbished himself, complete with brass lighting, oak wheels, and a hand-stitched leather seat that still had the subtle smell of saddle soap. He went back toward the tethered hut, which had been his home for the previous 40 years but was now deserted and reduced to its bare walls. As a last insult, a padlock was installed on the door. He was holding a modest framed picture of Margaret, his late wife. Behind the scratched glass, her smile had dimmed. Arthur slipped it into the backpack that was draped across his chest after carefully wrapping it with a linen. The sweeping farmland of Oxfordshire was beaten by the morning sun. The hedgerows wilted in stillness, and the air glistened off the stone walls even before 9. No breeze was blowing. Only heat. Long, merciless heat. Arthur clicked his tongue and murmured, "Come on, boy. We should leave before the road heats up." The concert squeaked to life as Kingsley drew forward. Wycliffe Hall's iron gate was open, but the house was evolving. The north wing was covered with scaffolding. The beginning of a posh hotel was marked by the rise of steel beams next to the ivy-covered mansion. The dry air carried the harsh drone of a crane in the distance. A security guard with a clipboard, a smug look, and a bright yellow vest emerged halfway down the road. "You're leaving late," the guard stated coldly. "At 10, the gate closes." Arthur didn't stutter. "Are you sure I'm gone?" "They're tearing down the stables next," the guard said, shrugging and moving aside as Arthur went by. "Horse feces has no place in a wellness spa." Arthur's mouth clenched. He didn't respond. He paused just where the thick hairs parted around an old scar and simply reached back to caress Kingsley's shoulder, his fingers grazing the soft hide. Despite the horse's steady gait, Arthur sensed a change. Kingsley was uneasy. He was always able to sense energy and moods. Arthur's was rushing inside as well. Arthur turned into the bridleway by the time they arrived at the edge of the estate. It was a centuries-old right-of-way that Arthur was more familiar with than his own blood. His daughter Eliza resided in Chipping Norton, and it wasn't the quickest way to get there. For a horse, however, and for a man who wished to remain unseen, it was the safest. Kingsley's ears pricked at every sound, yet he pulled without complaining. Arthur's spine tingled when the gig's wheels went into a rut, but he continued to concentrate on the road ahead. Bridleways wound through verdant hawthorn and elder tunnels before opening into sunlit alleys between arid, fractured fields. A few miles later, Arthur became suspicious. It blocked a route he usually followed, a shortcut across a shady field. A fresh padlock had been used to attach a chain that was coiled across the entryway. "Private, no entry" was written on a bright red sign that hung crookedly from it. "What the?" Arthur lowered himself and shook the chain. "New. Last night, it was installed." Under his breath, he swore. One of Kingsley's favorite stops was an old stone trough that was fed by a hillside spring, and that path cut 3 miles off the journey. He turned to face the horse again. The old boy's breathing had already become labored. Arthur looked around the bushes. There was a problem. He extracted a battered leather folder from the gig's side pocket. It contained Kingsley's legally needed horse passport as well as a folded piece of thick cream paper with handwriting in blue ink. Before she passed away 2 years ago, Lady Eleanor Wycliffe signed this short and straightforward letter. "Kingsley is to remain with Arthur Penrose," it said unequivocally. "He is a gift, not the estate's possession." No one had ever seen it before, Arthur never had to. A nasty uneasiness had been sparked by Crispin Locke, the estate's new manager, who had been buzzing around inquiring about Kingsley and implying that he was now company property. The guard, the barred way, the haste to go. The gears were turning, Arthur could feel. He gave Kingsley a quick look. "Old friend, they're attempting to confine us." Kingsley stepped closer, snorting softly as he sensed his voice. Arthur let out a sigh. The next part of the trip involved following the B road for about a mile before a different bridleway split off in the direction of the Northley woods. It would be riskier, noisier, and hotter. Clucking the reins, he rubbed his aching knees and hopped back atop the gig. Kingsley took a step ahead. A white van roared by, its wake rattling the hedges as they got closer to the B road. Arthur winced. Kingsley's stride quickened, but he didn't spook. The brief silence was broken by a loud honking as another car passed. To keep Kingsley balanced, Arthur gently tugged on the reins. "Now it's easy. You're doing fine. I've got you." Like a prayer, he whispered the words. Behind them, on a hill crest, a black Land Rover briefly appeared. Windows with tints. Vale Heritage had a number of them. Arthur's stomach turned. "Avoid turning around," he whispered, clutching the reins more firmly. "They will not stop us. Whatever it takes, we're going to Eliza's." With steady hoofbeats and gig wheels rolling over the faded chalk path, Kingsley plodded forth under the scorching heat, bringing both man and beast farther into a terrain that had turned into both a home and a battlefield. The path ahead would put them to the test in ways none of them had yet anticipated. The bridleway had become a ribbon of glistening white chalk by late morning, meandering past bone-dry fields and brittle hedgerows. The sun was cruel. The air twisted and shimmered as waves of heat bounced off the earth. Arthur felt as though he was breathing through all scarf every time. His shirt was drenched with sweat and stuck to his back. However, he remained silent. He simply focused on his horse's ears and the trail. Kingsley had slowed down. With greater drag in the step than previously, the ancient Shire's hooves crunched dry pebbles. In the gig, Arthur leaned forward a little to see Kingsley's flanks as they rose and fell. The horse's flanks were flapping like bellows, and he was holding still but breathing more heavily now. Arthur gently clicked his tongue, urging without pressuring. He was unable to pay for it. A little pool of shade was created by the trail's fork beneath an overhanging hawthorn tree. Arthur gently stopped Kingsley by pulling the reins. He said, "Baby, take a break," and stepped aside. The heat was like a thick cloak pressing down on him as soon as his boots touched the ground. After removing his flat cap and using a worn handkerchief to wipe his brow, he checked the gear. The wheels of the gig were covered with dust. A leather strap had begun to break and dry out. With a swift tug, he adjusted the buckle so that Kingsley's shoulders were not under as much strain. Then he extracted a tiny canvas bag from the space below the seat. It contained a half bottle of water, a tin of mints, oats, and a collapsible water dish. After unscrewing the top and taking a mouthful, he paused. He gave Kingsley a look. The horse stood quietly, ears twitching, one hoof raised a little off the ground. Arthur approached and filled the bowl with the remaining water, bringing it to Kingsley's lips. After taking a whiff, the horse started to slowly lap. Arthur saw each drop disappear. He then started dumping weight while crouching next to the trolley. A toolbox. Tack straps, 2 old spares. A blanket of folded wool. He put them next to the hedge. He stated out loud, "Can't carry it all, old man," but he wasn't sure if he was addressing Kingsley or himself. The piercing sound of an engine came from the high road, right behind the hedgerows. A van flashed by, white. Then another, this one crimson. They were both at least 50 or possibly 60. Arthur scowled. Although the new hotel development brought more commercial trucks in the last 3 months than in the previous 3 decades combined, the B Road wasn't designed for that type of traffic. A third car, a sleek black-windowed SUV, rolled down the slope. Arthur briefly believed it might be Crispin once more. It went by too fast to tell, though. In any case, it made no difference. He was determined to follow this path. No going back. Stiff from the heat, he clambered back into the gig and clucked the reins once more. Kingsley lumbered on. The bridleway swung into a section of gorse and dried ferns, the plants sharp and brittle, their hues bleached by the sun. Through the mist, Arthur narrowed his eyes. There ought to have been a brook somewhere up ahead, before the second intersection. Kingsley had plenty to drink, but not much, not even a trickle, actually. Enough to keep his hoofs cool. Once, as he drank, he recalled Margaret sitting there with a notepad in her lap, sketching Kingsley's profile. His heart fell when they got to the turn. It was dry in the stream bed. A pile of pebbles, weeds, and cracked mud. No water? Not even a dribble. It had also been taken by the heat. Arthur remained silent. He only felt his stomach churn as he gazed down at the dry earth. Arthur noticed the perspiration dripping down the horse's shoulder as Kingsley adjusted his weight once more while back on the gig. For Kingsley, he had to maintain his composure. The horse was waiting, trusting, and observing him. Arthur took the leather folder out of his coat pocket once more. His hands were shaking, but he opened it cautiously. Kingsley's horse passport, official records containing his microchip number, immunization records, and ownership history, was still undamaged inside. Next to it he unfolded Lady Eleanor Wycliffe's handwritten letter. Kingsley should be with you, Arthur. He is not real estate. He is related. I wrote this with the intention of giving him to you as a gift in appreciation of all of your years of devotion and affection. His destiny shouldn't be decided by anyone else. As though soaking up the power of the words, he read them twice. There was more to this than a horse. It wasn't. Kingsley wasn't a prop, but Crispin intended to parade him in front of investors, hang ribbons and antique bridles, and give city tourists the impression that they had touched real countryside tradition. He was history in action. A friend. A life Arthur had influenced. Arthur slipped the letter back after folding it once more. He glanced forward. More cars churned the dust in the distance. Fuel and burned grass filled the air. Water is still nowhere to be seen. There was only the distant hum of summer insects and Kingsley's hard, rhythmic breathing. Gently running his fingertips over Kingsley's shoulder, he reached lower. I understand, boy, he muttered. Water will be found soon. Then there was a clatter of hoofbeats, quick and light, coming from around the next bend. There came a biker in bright lycra, whizzing by with hardly a glance. Arthur gestured. Are there any streams ahead? He dialed. The rider remained silent. Didn't even turn around. Arthur sighed after staring after him. Dreadful tourists. On the next step, Kingsley faltered a little. Arthur acted quickly, stopping the gig. Quickly loosening the girth, he descended once more. The horse's gums were pale and dry when he examined them. Bad. He needed to obtain water for Kingsley. Soon? Further up, the bridleway split once more, and Arthur was aware that behind the vestry was a church with a public water tap. It might have been their only option if it hadn't been damaged or cut off like the others. Let's go, lad, he muttered with renewed determination. It's not that far now. Kingsley groaned softly but complied, moving forward with exhausted strength. They continued, one step at a time, toward a potentially empty promise of water. The bridleway became a tiny trail, surrounded by mossy stones and brambles. There was little shelter from the sun that now hung directly overhead, due to the thinning tree canopy above. The heat was now a thing, terrible, heavy, and unrelenting. Arthur's wet, dust-streaked shirt hung on his back. Even though his hands were rough from years of using tools and reins, they suddenly shook slightly. He gave Kingsley a quick look. The elderly Shire walked slowly. The edge of his lips was etched with foam. It took more work than ever to raise and lower his huge shoulders. More by accident than design, Arthur stopped the gig under a twisted yew tree. The equine did not struggle. With one rear leg cocked in exhaustion, he just stopped. With his knees cracking as he crouched, Arthur descended and grabbed the little water tin they hadn't touched since the morning. Empty. Still, hoping for a drop, he turned it over. Nothing. The ancient church he had recalled was a few feet in front of him, nestled next to a deteriorating stone wall, street. By the ridge, Agnes. Centuries old, little, almost engulfed in stillness and ivy. The bell tower appeared distorted in the rippling air, and the slate roof glistened in the heat. He knew the location, though. In order to get to the stone well behind the chapel, he took Kingsley off the bridleway and down the broken path. Once fed by a gravity-fed spring line from the hill above, a public spout had always been nestled in its side. When Arthur saw the iron tap, his heart began to rise a little. He arrived at it. The handle was turned. Not a sound. No water? Just a dry click. Harder, he turned again. Nothing has changed. His voice was a murmur, no, no, no. He surveyed the area. Near the side door of the church was a rusting notice board. Half torn and browned by the sun, a worn piece of paper floated languidly in the breeze. He bent in. Note: the public water source has been deactivated until further notice due to continuing estate construction and safety concerns. Property management is provided by Vale Heritage Limited. Arthur's jaw clenched. Crumpling the paper, he stuffed it inside his coat pocket after tearing it down. The fact that someone intentionally did this knowing that this well-served bridleway was used by walkers, riders, and travelers alike was just as cruel as the shutdown itself. Crispin, however, was unconcerned. Crispin viewed the countryside as a setting rather than a place to call home. A profit-making postcard. Kingsley moved behind him, his breath coming more heavily. His tongue, pallid and dry, dangled a little. Arthur pulled out a rag from his canvas satchel, washed Kingsley's neck and sides with it, and added a few drops of valuable water from a tiny emergency flask. The fabric was hot and dirty when it was removed. "Just hang in, lad," he said, leaning closer. "I'll locate something for us." The hefty wooden door creaked open from the church side. Blinking in the sunlight, a man wearing a dusty clerical shirt emerged. He was tall, had graying hair, and had a gentle face, but his eyes showed caution. "Arthur Penrose?" the man said. Startled, Arthur looked up. "That's correct. Are you still here, Father Lyndon?" "Last year, he retired." "My name is Caleb, brother. Heard that the closures are stable. I didn't anticipate seeing you here today." Arthur gave a slow nod. "Neither did I imagine I'd be walking a horse across the county." Brother Caleb moved nearer, staring at Kingsley with increasing anxiety. "In this heat, that's quite a haul." Arthur whispered, half to himself, "It wasn't supposed to be this way. I meticulously planned it. Each stop. Each water trough. However, Crispin?" He came to a halt. Caleb's gaze grew strained. "I am aware of the name. You mean Vale Heritage?" Arthur nodded slowly and bitterly. Caleb said, 2 nights ago, they sent men here. The old pump housing was taken out. All 4 taps on this ridge were turned off, citing hygiene compliance and renovation needs. Even the one at the rest of the Walker. Arthur's fists clenched. They obviously did. Caleb gave Kingsley another look. Nothing remains within the church. However, I have a rain barrel in my backyard. For a horse, yet not clean enough for a man. Arthur didn't hold out. Please. They led Kingsley to a broken barrel, that was partially covered in mesh behind the chapel. It was wet, but the water was lukewarm and slightly green. Arthur produced a scoop of tin, held it beneath the surface, and then raised it to Kingsley's lips. The horse took a single smell before gulping it down. Arthur scarcely noticed that he was holding on to the stone wall to keep himself upright as he closed his eyes in relaxation. "Are you all right?" Caleb inquired softly. "I'll survive," Arthur spit out. He required it more. Kingsley was allowed to drink for a number of minutes. Even so, Arthur moistened his rag once more and applied it to the horse's chest, neck, and legs. The animal became somewhat calmer. Caleb gave Arthur an apple from the chapel garden before they departed. "For him," he said. As well as this, he passed a folded paper map. "There is a small cattle pond 2 miles northwest of the abandoned railway, in case the following spring is also lost. Even though it's muddy, it will work." Arthur gratefully pocketed it. "I'm grateful." Arthur glanced down the road they had just left and then ahead to where more sun awaited them as they made their way back to the bridleway. This was no longer merely a detour. It was war. Kingsley's gait showed the first indication of a limp as he drew forward once more. It was slight but noticeable. Throughout the gig, Arthur felt it. There was a slight rhythmic stutter. The initial crack. The chapel's peaceful companionship and the hedgerow's meagre shade were gone as the bridleway wound upward into open fields. What awaited them was a white scar across the terrain, a long, merciless, sun-bleached chalk slope that rose steadily toward the ridge. Arthur narrowed his eyes in the glare. Like an ancient bone uncovered beneath the earth's surface, the slope glistened with white dust and shattered stone. Here, there was no refuge. No tree line. No water? Only the glistening heat rising from below and the boundless sky above. At the base, Kingsley paused. "I understand," Arthur muttered. "But we have no other option." With his hand lightly resting on Kingsley's flank, he stepped down, unfastened the girth straps once more, and walked alongside the horse as they started the gradual ascent. Now it seemed like every step was louder. The hoof clip on fragile chalk. The gig wheels straining uphill with a gentle grind. Arthur had to brace himself with one hand against the shaft after his boots slipped twice. Kingsley's breathing became labored once more halfway up. His ears drooped and his eyes blinked slowly. At his lip hung a dribble of foam. Arthur stopped and covered his eyes. The slope's summit didn't appear to be any closer. Kingsley paused. Simply stopped. Arthur faced him. "Lad, one more push." Kingsley remained still. Arthur put his hand on his shoulder and patted him lightly. However, the massive horse shuddered under his hand. A shuddering sensation throughout the body, akin to a wind blast ripping through bone and flesh. His front knees then gave way. Whoa, simple. It was too late when Arthur seized the reins. The gig's shafts jerked sideways and scraped the ground with a mechanical screech as Kingsley's legs failed and he fell onto the chalk. Arthur fell next to him, his heart racing. The horse was lying with his flanks twitching, his side heaving, and a heavy breathing rate. Clouds of dust rose around them, adhering to skin and perspiration. In order to block the sun, Arthur tore off his coat and laid it across Kingsley's neck. The cloth was barely damp now, but he took it out of his pocket, and pressed it to the horse's lips. All he could see were the unending fields. No trees. Farmhouses are not allowed. No numbers? Arthur muttered a curse to himself. I really ought to have rented a trailer. Asked for a favor. This was foolish. Stupid. He faced Kingsley once more. You had faith in me. He was afraid that Kingsley wouldn't wake up again because it was so silent that he could hear the flies circling. Arthur loosened the breast collar and freed the shafts by fully unfastening the gig. He then made a temporary shelter for the horse by pulling the waterproof sheet from the back of the cart over it. He held the edges up with 2 fence posts from the next border line and his toolbox. Although it wasn't flawless, it was able to shield the sun's worst rays. Feeling the quiet thump of Kingsley's heartbeat, he laid down next to him and put a palm to his chest. Still powerful. But the horse remained motionless. Simply take a nap. That's all, Arthur murmured quietly. He took out his flask of water once more. There is only 1 swallow remaining. He gazed at it. He then carefully unscrewed the top and put it to Kingsley's lips. The horse opened its eyes. He tasted the remaining drops as his tongue touched the metal rim. Arthur gave a small smile. Well done, boy. From somewhere over the ridge came a hot, dry air that carried the slightest hint of wildflowers. However, it had little effect on the tightness that was drawing Arthur's chest taut. Heat, tiredness, and something older caused his eyesight to blur, not tears. Perhaps guilt. On her last day, he had assured Margaret that he would never allow Kingsley to become a showpiece. She had said, he's not a trophy. He is a part of us. And he was lying like this now. A hill has broken it. Since Arthur had been too arrogant to seek assistance. He brushed the chalk dust from the horse's mane and muttered, I failed you. I should have anticipated this. Kingsley remained still. After a while, though, his head rotated just enough that his nose made contact with Arthur's forearm. A gentle prod. Arthur stopped. Then a half-choked laugh came out. You are a magnificent brute, loyal, and stubborn. He got up. Stunted. After that, it straightened. He looked around the hill. On the lower side of a dry stone wall, a trickle of green clung. Ivy. Trembling. And a different color underneath it. A darker one. Wet. Arthur narrowed his eyes. His heartbeat accelerated. He climbed cautiously toward the spot, leaving the tarp in place. Despite the slipping of dust and chalk beneath his feet, he went quickly due to instinct and desperation. With scratched fingertips, he tore back the ivy as he got to the wall. There was an ancient stone trough underneath it, fractured but undamaged, half buried in moss and debris. And there was moisture within it, glimmering dimly in the darkness. Not very much. But a few? Pressing his palm against the cool stone, he fell to his knees. From under the trough, a trail of moisture ran off into the slope. You're there? Crawling through the earth below, he discovered a spring's catchment, a small canal created decades ago. Although it wasn't flowing at the moment, the ground was dark, and there might have been a cup's worth of water in the trough. Enough to make a difference. He dipped the bandana he always carried clipped to his waist into the little puddle and then filled the tin cup. He ran back down the slope, really ran. Kingsley's eyes were wide awake now, but he was still under the cover. Arthur offered the cup while crouching. The equine drank. Arthur turned around. Once more. But then again. A couple extra swallows each time. His legs screamed louder with each trip, but he chose to ignore them. On the fourth attempt, Kingsley's head was fully raised. He evened out his breathing. With a grunt, he moved and forced himself to his knees. Holding his breath, Arthur took a step back. The old Shire stood up, shaking his mane vigorously. Dust fell like snow from his flanks. He was standing even though his legs were shaking. Arthur moved forward and lightly touched Kingsley's brow. "We haven't finished yet." "By no means." Despite the sun's minor dip, the heat persisted. Like a sheet of glass, it hovered over the hills, catching every wind gust. Under the makeshift tarp, Arthur stood next to Kingsley. The ancient Shire horse was still shaky on his legs, but he was now alert, his ears perking up at the distant buzz of insects. His eyes were no longer dull, but his sides still rose and fell with heavy breaths. After using a dirty handkerchief to wipe the perspiration off his neck, Arthur went back to face the dry stone wall where he had discovered the dripping dampness. Deeper under the tangled pile of rubble and plants, he felt there must be more, some source, some vein of spring water. He didn't hold off. He was unable to. He firmly patted Kingsley's shoulder and murmured, "Hang tight, lad. I'll bring more." After putting the 2 empty flasks in his belt and retrieving his tiny folding spade from the gig's tool pouch, he started up the slope once more. Although the ground beneath him was unstable and chalky, he moved with the assurance of a man on borrowed time. Returning to the wall, Arthur knelt next to the stone trough and rubbed his palm over the moss. He noticed a faint groove just to the left of the basin's lip, which looked to him like a symbol that had been partially etched and almost engulfed by time and fungus. He used his blade to gently scratch it. It was a crest. A circle with a faded W inside. Wycliffe. Arthur rested his heels. "This belonged to them," he said. "The mark of the family. A public trough that was abandoned for centuries of drovers and riders. And there had been an attempt to conceal it. All of a sudden, it made sense, Crispin's efforts to privatize, cut off historic trails and water supplies, and remove any indication that these lands were formerly shared." Arthur's jaw tightened. It wasn't merely self-centered if this trough had been purposefully hidden, if someone had buried it beneath leaves to keep travelers like him from passing. It was against the law. He looked further. He struck a trickle in a matter of minutes. Clear, thin, and frigid. A spring. If left exposed, it would gradually fill the trough as it ran along the base of the wall and seeped through a small crevice. He made a path, added flat stones to strengthen the borders, and let the water to pool. He then ran them back down to Kingsley after filling his flasks and soaking the towel once again. The horse now drank more gradually, and with less eagerness. Arthur wiped his legs once more while observing the gradual waning of the shaking. His voice was husky as he whispered, "You're made of iron. You always were." Arthur paced the field's edge, his eyes alert, while Kingsley lay in the shaded area. Since the start of the Wycliffe estate sale, Crispin had been subtly lobbying the parish council to redraw boundaries and reroute paths, even though the bridleway was officially public land and part of an ancient riding route between settlements. Water blockage was one thing. But using the estate crest to disguise a registered trough, that was a whole other matter. Arthur took out his little notebook by reaching into the gig's inside cover. He flipped past veterinarian notes and outdated tack measurements to a blank page, where he scrawled the following information. The Wycliffe crest is seen on the stone trough beneath the chalk ridge. Obscured by vegetation. Water source unharmed. Proof of intentional hiding. He put it aside and used his old flip phone to take a picture of the trough. It was a start, but the image was blurry and hardly readable. Kingsley was back at the tarp, shifting his weight and starting to eat the dry grass. That meant something to Arthur. The appetite is back. The first indication that his body was no longer in a panic. They were unable to stay long, though. As he stood next to the horse, Arthur stroked his palm down his neck to feel for any heat or indications of stress. The tremor had subsided, and the veins beneath the skin had softened. He was just getting better. Arthur looked at the gig. The left wheel was stuck against a projecting spoke, and the shafts were twisted by the mountainous climb and collapse. Sweat trickled down his chin as he worked silently, taking his wrench from the toolbox. His lower back ached with every step, but he chose to ignore it. The wheel finally came loose after 20 minutes of grunting, swerving, and ultimately smashing the shaft with a flat rock. He looked at the spokes. Still whole? Wiping chalk dust from his palms, he sat back and let out a breath. Once more, they might move. The tools, the rolled-up wool blanket, and even the half-empty oat sack on the dry stone wall were among the few items he brought this time. Now they would be ballast. Only his papers, the water flasks, the leather satchel containing Margaret's picture, and the handwritten note from Lady Wycliffe were safe. That letter had begun to feel more like a weapon than a token. He gave Kingsley a look. "It's time to leave." After guiding the horse back into place, he started securing the harness. To ease the strain on Kingsley's shoulders, he tightened only the neck strap this time, moved the shafts slightly outward, and left the girth free. The elderly Shire had grown taller. Willing, but not strong. They were moving when they started up again, even though the gig was a little off balance and the wheels squeaked more. Behind them was the ridge. Ahead, the air glistened. Arthur glanced back at the faint Wycliffe crest and the stone trough one last time. In that wall, they had buried history. Yet not enough deep. Down the route, Arthur noticed a grey SUV hesitating close to a private gate, and then reversing as they re-entered the bridleway. He stopped. The car hovered, and then vanished. He didn't have to speculate as to who it was. Crispin was observing. Arthur squinted, and muttered something under his breath. Then continued to observe. He lightly clicked the reins. Kingsley took a step ahead. The sun had turned vengeful by early afternoon. From a cloudless sky, it poured down, turning every stone, hoofprint, and worn bridleway patch into a cracked, dry crust. Everything was now covered in chalk dust, including Arthur's boots, his lips, the gig's leather, and the coarse hairs on Kingsley's sweat-drenched back. It was more than an hour since Arthur last talked. He had a raw throat. In his mouth, his tongue felt bloated. Even though the old Shire had accepted it with gratitude, Kingsley now walked slowly and deliberately, his neck down and his ears back, after the last of the water had been poured down his mouth just past the stone wall. Through the reins, Arthur sensed the strain. Every stride was a silent protest. Both of the intersections they had passed were familiar. Arthur, however, had purposefully stayed away from the left-hand lane close to Lower Tithe Farm. Despite being shaded, that path would put them in danger of passing a brand-new Vale heritage construction site. He didn't think Crispin didn't have contractors or cameras ready to snoop about. Rather, he advanced across the bare ridge line. Now, that choice was a burden. A small hill rose up ahead, hardly a slope, yet it like Everest in this heat. Arthur gently clucked the reins. "Just too much, boy. After that, we relax." Kingsley remained silent. Squinting toward the horizon, Arthur wiped his forehead. Just a few hundred feet to the south, the bridleway ran parallel to a B road, the swarm of faraway engines rising and falling with the breeze like a wasp swarm. It was still miles away, but he could make out a few roofs in the distance, perhaps the outskirts of a village. Fields between them. Open. Empty. At the top of the ascent, Arthur stopped the gig. Below, the scenery stretched out. The borders of the dry fields curled brown. Old border fences were dotted with hedgerows. Additionally, there was a little hump to the right where a green lane connected to the bridleway. Arthur made his decision there. He grabbed the canvas tarp folded behind the seat, unclipped the gig's front lock, and descended. He felt the sun hit him like a hammer. All the muscles moaned. However, he made his limbs comply. He anchored the gig at a noticeable angle from the road by jamming the front wheel against a low boulder at the top of the hill. Next, he moved to the side of the road, unfolded the faded green tarp, and started securing it between two wooden posts that he buried with his own hands and the heel of his boot. When it was finished, the gig was visible from the road below, slanted and recognizable like a flag of distress. A tourist in difficulty. Arthur waited by its side. Minutes went by. Then there was a tire rumbling. On the road below, a dark blue SUV slid into view, halted just enough, and continued on its way. Without hesitation. No recognition. Still, he held out his hand. Around the corner, the car vanished. Arthur lowered his shoulders. Slowly, he looked back to Kingsley, who was standing head down and motionless in the gig traces. He was exhausted again by the heat. Arthur knelt in the shade of the slanting cart after walking a few yards back. He had trembling hands. He took his ancient flip phone, an unbreakable artifact from a bygone era, out of his pocket. There was a fracture in the screen. The shell cracked. However, it activated. 2% battery. He wasted no time. He opened it, navigated the small screen, and located the sole important number. Eliza. He pressed send. Nothing. No signal? He got up, moved toward the edge of the ridge, raised the phone, and waved it gently. Nothing has changed. After blinking to life, a tiny bar disappeared. Arthur tightened his jaw. He continued walking, stepped onto a level surface, and picked up the phone once more. 2 bars this time. Feeble. But enough. He picked up a message. Eliza. Need help. Near Green Lane Junction. Kingsley struggling. Over send he lingered. Next, it was added. Water gone. GPS bad. Look for cart on ridge. He pressed the transmit button. The screen went blank. Then? The message has been sent. After letting out a breath, Arthur put the phone in his coat pocket. The signal may weaken. The battery would run out of power. However, it was suddenly visible, a glimmer of optimism that extended back to his daughter. He raised his head. Kingsley continued to chew. Arthur blinked. The equine had relocated to an area of unkempt grass close to the trail's edge. Like on spring rides, he was tearing tufts from the ground as he nibbled them, slowly and meticulously. Arthur laughed in a raspy voice. Well, I'll be. As he approached, he sliced many bunches of green shoots with his penknife. And more. After setting them on a rag, he carried them back beneath the gig's shade and gently let them fall by Kingsley's hoofs. The horse ate while bending. The fact that the creature was still eating while being too exhausted to move and too hot to urinate was incredibly human. I'm still trying. Arthur's chest rose and fell like bellows as he leaned back against the gig's wheel. Once more, he observed the road. Another vehicle went by. Then silence for a minute. Pulling the backpack onto his lap, he did so. The flap was opened. Margaret's picture, with her gentle smile captured in time, is inside. The folded note from Lady Eleanor was beside it. He unfurled it once more, tracing the ink with his thumb as if it were braille. You should have him? You hear that, Maggie? He said, leaning his head back and closing his eyes. He is still engaged in combat. Then his eyes opened and he looked up at the sky. It was up to them now? Or anyone is observing? There was an odd silence in the late afternoon. The sort of silence that was warning rather than tranquil. The birds had stopped talking as well. Even though there were no clouds yet, the heavy air felt like damp wool against Arthur's skin. With his hands on his knees, his legs extended, and his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, he leaned against the slanted gig in a half-sitting position. Kingsley was standing close by, loosely attached to the cart, munching on a patch of grass Arthur had mowed and set next to him. He only ate enough to sustain his movement. Invisible flies made his flanks twitch. In a patient, never-ending cycle, his head sank every few minutes and then up again. Arthur took another look at the phone. Dead. He put it back in his pocket and looked downhill toward the B road, which was just barely visible through the hedgerows. One car went by first, then another, both of them too far away to notice the flag or understand what it meant. Eliza had been nowhere to be seen. There were no hoof sounds or recognizable voices calling. Then he sensed it. The temperature changed. Hardly noticeable, like a curtain's movement. He looked up and saw the line of clouds, dark and thick and rapidly growing, forming on the western ridge. At last the storm had reached them. With his back screaming and his legs rigid, he forced himself to stand. "Lad, the rain is coming," he whispered. "You might actually get what you need." Kingsley whined a little, anticipating rather than panicked. Arthur retrieved the old oilskin tarp from the gig and fastened it between a bent fence post and the cart. He then proceeded to the distant side and unfastened a second piece of material, which was tattered and covered in old stitches. It had long since been converted for field use and had been Margaret's garden blanket. He did his best to distribute it throughout Kingsley's back. Not flawless. Not even sufficient. However, something. Abruptly, the first drips appeared, cold, loud, and fat. And more. The dry chalk walkway became dark in a matter of seconds. The dust turned to muck. It felt as though the rain had been waiting for hours to fall in this one spot. Arthur raised his face and allowed the water to splash at him. His jaw dropped. He sipped just enough to moisten his tongue, but not much. He then hurried to his canvas bag, took out the tin cup, and placed it under the tarp's lowest corner, gathering runoff as if it were gold. Unrelenting, wild, and wonderful, the cacophony filled the air. Water beading on his mane, Kingsley shuffled under the blanket's weight. He closed his eyes a little. His nose wrinkled, but not out of alarm. With relief, Arthur squatted next to the tarp, shivering as he reached for the cup and watched it slowly fill. After taking a heavy drink, he filled it up again and brought it to Kingsley's lips. The horse also took a sip. Arthur smiled for the first time in the day. However, the moment was over. He shivered. At first, he had been too busy moving and feeling relieved to notice the chill. But now it was creeping in, into his chest, up his arms, and down his spine. His lungs rattled with a dry cough. Then another. He hunched over a little and put his fist to his lips. He groaned as he slumped back down onto the damp ground, his forehead wet from the heat as much as the rain. Inside, it's hot. A heat that throbbed in his joints and pounded behind his eyes. "Not right now," he whispered. "Not just yet?" He attempted to stand. Couldn't. His legs resisted. His knees gave way. The world swayed. After snatching the gig's wheel and getting himself up, he staggered under the tarp. Under his boots, the earth squished. Now shivering severely, he slumped against the side of the gig and collapsed into the canvas corner. He breathed in short gasps. His flesh pricked. Like paints on damp paper, his ideas were hazy. "Maggie," he murmured. "I might need some assistance here." A shadow moved through the rain sheet. It wasn't a human. Kingsley was the one. With a casual flick of his enormous head, the horse had turned and untied himself from the post. He was now standing next to the gig, his body pressed slightly against the tarp's windward side, protecting Arthur from the worst of the rain. Slowly, Arthur blinked. Perhaps, he thought, he was dreaming. Kingsley, however, did not move. His nostrils flared with serene intensity as he stood there, his broad flank functioning as a living wall. Arthur put a tentative touch on the horse's leg and reached out. "Well done," he snarled. "You knew all along." He leaned his head back against the wheel of the cart. He half closed his eyes. The warmth of fever replaced the chill, and an odd calm took its place. He had no idea how long he had been lying like that, for 20 minutes, an hour, or longer. Time has been distorted. He stirred, however, somewhere between slumber and consciousness. The rain continued to fall. Kingsley remained upright. And Arthur managed to concentrate enough to reach into the canvas satchel in spite of the fire in his lungs. He carefully hooked the rope around Kingsley's halter, which was a piece of braided leather reins that he had altered for emergency leads weeks earlier. His hands were shaking as he attached a small laminated card with Elizabeth's address to the gig shaft's side and fastened it with a leather strap. His voice was almost gone when he whispered to the storm. "Take him to her if I don't wake up." Then everything darkened. Kingsley, however, remained. The kind of dawn that crept in behind a veil of low grey clouds and damp mist that clung to the ground like stale breath was sluggish to come. Sometime in the early hours, the rain had stopped, and the bridleway was slippery and gleaming in the dim light. Through the hedgerows, fog floated. The fragrance of crushed chalk and moist earth filled the air. Kingsley remained motionless, his enormous body rigid and dark against the gentle grey morning light. The old garden blanket had slipped halfway off his back, his mane was glued to one side from the storm, and his legs were soiled to the knee. His eyes, however, were open. Observing. Awaiting. Arthur was still standing. Wrapped in the same oilskin tarp he had used to cover Kingsley the day before, he lay curled beneath the tilting gig. He held his hands close to his chest. His face was red, wet, and still. He breathed shallowly through his broken lips, although they had a faint, low rattling. Kingsley's head dropped. Once pushed him. But then again. No answer? The horse's ears flicked forward as he gently raised his head. Flaring his nose, he tasted the air. The smell of smoke came from a distance, faint yet distinct. Smoke from wood? A chimney. Some cottage down the bridleway had a fire going. Human-like somewhere. He caught something else when he smelled again. Clover. Damp stone. The water's little iron content. Then Kingsley turned to the gig, planted his hoofs wide, and moved back from the tarp as if he had made a decision that was older than words. His head bowed, he pushed against the leather strap that Arthur had clipped the previous evening. It was fastened to his harness previously. He found the loose end in his mouth. He pulled. There was a creak in the shaft. Kingsley backed himself into place, one leg at a time. Leaning forward into the traces, he used soft, practiced motions to adjust the slack. He had previously performed in processions for Lady Eleanor's final ride, Margaret's funeral, and the local festival. He was aware of its equilibrium. The beat of it. The gig was not broken, but it was still skewed, and a little dented from the fall days before. Insufficient to halt a horse such as Kingsley. He exhaled slowly, blinked once, and started to walk. The initial movements were cautious. It was a slippery road. The weight is not uniform. However, Kingsley made up for it by moving his weight slightly to the left and then to the right, re-establishing the beat. First the wheels rolled grudgingly, then they caught. The performance squeaked along. Beneath the tarp, Arthur's corpse lay motionless, his torso being tenderly held by the cushioned bench and bundled material. As the wagon lurched, his head lolled a little, but he remained inside, protected and safe. Kingsley took a step. He took his time. Didn't freak out. He just followed the memories and the aroma. That's how elderly horses act after they've traveled the same paths 100 times. The ridge where the flag had flown was gone as he passed. Arthur had dug for water in the ruined trough beneath the wall, which he passed. A bramble scratched his thigh as he passed a low incline, but he continued. With gentle brushstrokes of grey trees and verdant hills, the dawn unfolded before him like a damp picture. He shone as mist clung to his back. Eliza Hartley was already awake, miles away. Sometime after midnight, her phone buzzed. It was an old number that she initially didn't recognize. But she was chilled by the message. Eliza. Need help. Near Green Lane Junction. Kingsley struggling. Since then, she hadn't slept. She was now standing next to her husband Daniel and local veterinarian Dr. Priya Shah, wearing boots and a raincoat. Their eyes scanned the fog as they waited close to the bridleway gate on the north side of Chipping Norton. Daniel held a tea thermos in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Priya carried her medical equipment and field scanner with her. "This bothers me," Eliza said as she paced. Daniel mutely remarked, "He sent a message." "That's something." Priya gave a nod. But everything could have been ruined by the rain. Then the noise was heard. Hoofs. Slow. Even. "I'm coming." They pivoted. A shadow appeared in the fog, dim at first, then solid. A equine. A cart. Under the canvas, a guy sagged. Eliza let out a gasp. Kingsley. She slipped once in the mud while running, but she managed to catch herself. Kingsley halted when he saw her. He jerked his ears forward. He locked his legs. Eliza pulled the canvas aside as she arrived at the gig. "Dad." Arthur was on fire. He breathed shallowly, his face flushed scarlet. He was breathing, though. Priya showed up next to her, having already taken out her scanner. She said, "He has a fever. We should get him down." With caution. Daniel stepped in to assist, and the two of them wrapped Arthur in a dry blanket before lowering him to the grass. Priya nodded after taking a look at his pulse. "We grabbed him before it worsened, but it's pneumonia. He is fortunate." "No," Eliza said softly as she turned to face Kingsley. "He is loved." In the cold, steam rose from the back of the great horse that stood close by. He observed Arthur being cared for, his eyes serene, his body motionless. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Priya approached him and ran a delicate hand down his neck. She whispered, "You brought him home, didn't you?" After taking her scanner out, she ran it under Kingsley's neck. A beep. A figure. His microchip. "He is in good health," she said. "Weary. Dehydrated. However, there are no injuries." Opening her satchel, Eliza did so. The leather horse passport was inside, wrapped in plastic. She also took out the folded letter. Daniel gave her a look. "Should we?" "Not just yet," Eliza replied. "First, let Dad get up." For a while, they stood silently as the rain trickled down the trees. With a gentle snort, Kingsley lowered his head to brush against the damp grass, content that the journey was over for the time being. The sky had started to clear by the time Arthur woke up. As the clouds began to thin, slivers of sunlight broke through, warming the soggy fields and gradually driving the mist away from the bridleway. When he opened his eyes, he saw gentle movement, figures that were hazy from fever and sleep, floating around him like spectres. "Dad! Can you hear me, Dad?" Arthur blinked once more. The voice of Eliza. Now closer. His eyesight improved just enough to reveal her face streaked with rain and her tear-streaked eyes above a tired smile. "Eliza." She brushed his hair back while bending down. "You're all right. You're at home." His voice was ragged and his throat was dry. "Kingsley." She choked back sorrow as she added, "He brought you here. You succeeded." Arthur looked around. Kingsley stood just past the hedgerow's edge, his figure broad and steady, his body matted and smeared with muck, watching. It had been an hour since the horse had left that location. He had resisted drink and nourishment until Arthur had received medical attention. "I was certain he would do it," Arthur muttered. Eliza gently reprimanded, "You ought to have called us sooner. We would have brought a trailer and picked you up." Arthur forced a meek grin. It's difficult to drag pride behind a cart. Then the gravel crackled beneath the tires. At the top of the bridleway entry, a dark green Land Rover appeared, its engine too confident and polished for a country track. With a brake hiss, the car slowed and then rolled to a stop. The door opened. Crispin Locke went outside. He had a folded leather folder under one arm, his customary waxed jacket, and pricey boots that were too pristine for actual labor. He looked around, seeing Arthur half-seated under a blanket, Eliza kneeling next to him, Kingsley tethered serenely in the distance, and Shire standing watchful. Crispin said, "Good morning," in a voice that was too polished to be sincere. There was some excitement, according to several people, with horses and gigs wandering throughout the village. Nobody responded. He took a step toward her. "Is that Kingsley?" Priya took a small step away from him and the horse. "Yes." With a languid nod, Crispin smiled courteously, as if he were announcing a prize at a village celebration. "So, I'm afraid I'll have to request that he be brought back to the estate. His name is on file with Wycliffe's property inventory. You realize that it has to do with ownership and insurance." Eliza stood up. She said plainly, "No." Crispin's eyebrows went up. "Pardon me." With a calm voice, Eliza stepped forward. "Kingsley is not a member of Vale heritage. Lady Eleanor herself gave him to my father. The letter is with us." Crispin's courteous mask remained intact. "Ah well, there must have been some confusion. Property rights are not transferred by a verbal expression of gratitude. This horse is worth 6 figures, and it doesn't have any official paperwork." Arthur moved behind the cover. He croaked, "You're on my daughter's property." And uttering absurdities. Crispin's smile faded as he turned. "Mister, we're not here to quarrel, Penrose, but I do appreciate your past with the estate. Our goal is to protect an asset that is presently being mismanaged." "Mishandled?" Eliza yelled. "My father was just saved by him." With a groan, Crispin rearranged the folder beneath his arm. "Regardless of feelings, this animal has a microchip attached to it. Should we let the scanner make the decision?" Priya remained still. "Done," she responded, taking the portable gadget out of her coat pocket. She held it under Kingsley's neck and turned it on. A beep. "The Wycliffe registry matches the chip number," Crispin boasted. "There you have it." Priya raised her opposite hand. She nodded to Eliza and said, "And here is his horse passport. The microchip number corresponds." And a letter was stapled to the back page. Eliza gave it to him. As a token of appreciation for his decades of devotion and friendship, Priya read aloud, "I, Eleanor Wycliffe, give full ownership of Kingsley to Arthur Penrose. Estate property no longer applies to this horse." Signed and dated. Crispin's gaze swept across the page. "That hasn't been notarized." "Might be made." Calmly, Priya stated, "It's on personal Wycliffe stationery. With her signature on it. And since the parish council has witnessed it previously, they will confirm it." Crispin's self-assurance started to falter a little. "This is a grey area in law." Arthur cleared his throat. "No, it isn't. You simply dislike losing." Crispin looked across at Eliza. "I might request an injunction." "You could," she responded, taking a step forward. "However, by the time you do, Kingsley will be wearing the same brass tack he pulled for your investors while he stands in front of 100 villages at the harvest fair. The distinction is that people will be able to determine whose side he truly supported this time." Crispin's expression grew stern. "And I've already sent a photo of the letter and passport to the district council," Priya continued. "As well as the local newspaper. Just in case." Crispin's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The gentle jangle of Kingsley's harness was the only sound for a few period. Then he closed the folder with a snap. "Well, this isn't the end of it." Turning, he walked back to the Land Rover with stiffness. As the automobile rolled away, the tires spat gravel. Eliza returned to her father's knees. "Are you all right?" Arthur gave a nod. "I wish he had attempted to seize the reins. It would have been nice to watch Kingsley step on his toes." They chuckled, just enough to decompress. Daniel came forward with a new blanket. "Old man, let's get you home." Priya gave Kingsley a pat on the side. "Hero, you too." Kingsley remained motionless, his ears perking and his gaze kind. Fanfare is unnecessary. He had fulfilled his obligation already. The fever finally subsided 3 days later. The color had returned to Arthur's face as he lay in a borrowed bed under Eliza's guest room window, his chest still rattling lightly with his breaths. He stopped coughing up blood. The antibiotics were in effect. Warm broth, fresh linens, and the faint sound of his family passing through the corridors had all been comforting. That morning, he awoke to the sound of hooves, steady, familiar, pacing just below the window, and a sliver of sunlight peeking through the curtain. Not too loud. It's not urgent. Simply be there. Slowly, wincing at the tightness, he turned his head and saw him. Kingsley. Standing in the improvised corral in the back garden, with the golden autumn light, and stone walls as a backdrop. Mud has been cleaned off his legs and dusted off his coat. Yes, he appeared exhausted, but happy. Arthur struggled to his feet, his fingertips clinging to the edge of the bed frame. Eliza emerged from the door. "You're conscious?" Arthur gave a nod. "He remains here." With a little smile, she remarked, "He hasn't left the window since we brought you home. I believe he's ensuring you don't vanish once more." Arthur gave a raspy laugh. He was always the one who was cautious. She gently led him to the chair by the window, and assisted him in swinging his legs over the side of the bed. There, father and daughter sat together to watch the horse that has drawn ceremonial gigs, funeral carts, and now an elderly man through the most trying time of his life. The sounds of Daniel brewing tea permeated the kitchen downstairs. At the table, Theo and Jack whispered over a crossword puzzle. For the first time in years, the house was complete and livable. They took Arthur, who was wearing a bulky coat and scarf, out into the garden later that afternoon. Kingsley came slowly, as though he could sense his weakness. He came very close to Arthur's chair. The elderly guy extended his hand, grazing the velvety snout with his fingertips. "You took me home," he muttered. "You recalled." Kingsley softly pressed his head against Arthur's shoulder as he lowered it. Arthur's cheek was wet with a single tear. "Good boy." The situation with Crispin ended quietly but conclusively a week later. The parish council had convened. Priya Shah had turned in her report, the handwritten letter, and Kingsley's passport and microchip ID. Photographs of the sealed stone trough, now exposed and flowing once more, have been added by Eliza. A number of the villagers had also shared their recollections, including tales of Kingsley dragging brides across the town square, youngsters learning to ride on his wide back, and Arthur caring for the horses at Wycliffe Hall. There was a unanimous vote. Kingsley wasn't owned by an estate. Arthur owned him. It has always been. The council has complained to Vale Heritage about the improper deployment of private security forces to threaten a former resident, and the blocking of public water sources. An inquiry was launched. After that, Crispin Locke was discreetly moved to an out-of-county project. He was not missed in the village. A small ceremony was conducted on the grass the following Sunday under a gentle morning sun. Arthur had demanded that there be no celebration. Only acknowledgement. Children from the nearby school read little notes about history and kindness in a line. The St. Agnes vicar talked about the spirit of the land and perseverance. Kingsley immediately attempted to chew the ribbon that Priya had given him. The mayor presented Arthur with a little wooden plaque that read, "In honor of Arthur Penrose, for preserving our living heritage, one hoofprint at a time." Arthur accepted the award. However, what most stayed with everyone was the moment that followed. Arthur got up, moved cautiously to Kingsley's side, and touched the horse's bridle with a worn palm. He turned to face the assembled group of family members, neighbors, and interested guests and uttered just this. "He is not something that should be owned. He is neither a sign nor a number. He has a soul. And he returned me double for all I provided him." Then, with assistance, he clambered aboard the gig and seized control. Beneath him, Kingsley moved steadily. And for the first time since he left Wycliffe Hall, Arthur Penrose was something other than a sick man, a displaced servant, or a remnant of a bygone era. Once more, he was a horseman. And it was seen by all. Weeks went by. Fall grew deeper. Life became stable. With his strength gradually recovering, Arthur stayed with Eliza's family. He moved his study into the guest room. Kingsley's new field is the garden. Most mornings, they walked a brief distance down the bridleway together. No cart. There is no pressure. Just familiar pathways with old friends. There was joy and light in the Hartley home on Christmas Eve. In Arthur's room, Theo placed a little tree. A platter of ginger biscuits was brought in by Jack. In the window, Eliza lit a candle. Kingsley stood outside, staring through the glass, close to the fence. A framed picture with Arthur in the cart and Kingsley in the front, both of them facing forward, was resting on the ledge. The letter from Lady Eleanor was beside it. Below it, there was a note from Eliza, written in her distinctive, legible handwriting. "For the one that brought you home, and for all the miles you walked." Arthur closed his eyes and grinned. This was more than just a journey's conclusion. It was the start of a sense of community.